was actually in Halifax. So I got one of my first teaching job, first academic job was at Dalhousie Law School some 20 years ago. So which makes me feel a bit old that it was that long ago. It doesn't seem that long ago. And frankly, the year that I spent in Halifax was really one of my favorite years. It gave me my start not just for my own career, but the people were so warm, and the opportunity to be in a community that's a true community was a real delight. And so frankly, I've been back to Halifax on a number of occasions since, but not as regularly as I would have liked. And so for me, it's a disappointment, even just that I didn't have the chance to get back. But I'm at least happy that technology has gotten far better today than it was certainly back then. I can tell you back then, I discovered this thing called the World Wide Web, and the prospect of emailing and the like. It was at the somewhat early days, using things like Netscape Navigator and Yahoo in its early days. And so if someone would have told me and many others then that we could be doing this in this fashion, with you looking at my screen and being able to see what I have to say through just a plain old internet connection, I think few would have believed it. So it's quite amazing to see the way things have changed. That's actually perhaps a good segue for where I want to lead us today, because things have changed in the space that I want to talk about as well, sort of the intersection between law, privacy, security, and surveillance. We've, of course, seen dramatic changes just in the last year. When we used to talk about cybersecurity, I think it's fair to say most, as part of this changed conversation, would think of things like this. I mean, government talking about cybersecurity, the role that individuals have in terms of being more aware of some of the security issues and threats on their own devices and machines, and ensuring that they're up to date, and simply practicing good security hygiene, so to speak. And of course, the role that companies play as well, and the role that government could potentially play in setting standards and enforcement in some instances, and dealing with some of these issues. That's where I think many of the talks that looked at that intersection between law, technology, security, and the like would go in years past. That's no longer the case, though. Now we are increasingly talking about who's doing the infecting, and a whole range of issues that have come to light since last June, which I think have dramatically shifted much of the conversation, although I think we could get into an interesting discussion about how many people are involved in this conversation, and whether or not it is a sort of small group concerned with security, like people here today, or people from the privacy world, civil liberties and the like, or whether or not it's that broader conversation that I think a lot of us think needs to happen. I have to admit, there's times where I'm optimistic and sometimes a bit more pessimistic. All of this, of course, is being driven by Edward Snowden. On the optimistic side, I take a look at the announcement just this week, or at least the report just this week. I believe the announcement may come as soon as tomorrow, that the Obama administration is planning to curve back some of the surveillance activities that it's had with respect to calls, the bulk collection of phone conversations, of the metadata associated with those conversations. At a minimum, it's metadata, as many of you will know, within the United States. Other reports suggest that it is all calls, including all content, in some foreign jurisdictions, with one recent report talking about the prospect of collecting all conversations, content, and the like, over a 30-day period, and simply cycling through that on a regular basis. It's a surveillance capability that I think many didn't think existed, or at a minimum felt like the stuff of science fiction, and yet has been reality. It's been revealed by Snowden, and I think for those that have expressed concern, and I make no bones about the fact that for me this has been a source of serious concern. The fact that in the United States, at least, we have seen some amount of pushback, certainly from many different groups, but also from various politicians. I think a more robust discussion and debate, at least at a political level, over some of these issues, certainly when as compared to what we see here in Canada. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes, where we've seen far less when it comes to some of these issues. There is some, I think, some reason for optimism when we see announcements like this. At the same time, I'm often left with the sense that this is just so large and so overwhelming that I'm not totally convinced that the public, the broader public, is on side. As an example, this was a recent release. You can see it's almost exactly a month ago now, coming out of the UK, revealing a program from their surveillance agency, their security surveillance agency, on the monitoring of webcams, which, as I look at the little green light on my laptop here, has, I guess, resonates particularly strongly, because lots of people, of course, using these kinds of technologies that, in a sense, I'm using right now. And it turned out that almost a couple of million users were targeted by the GCHQ in the United Kingdom over a 6-month period. Now, in almost any other circumstance, I think it's fair to say that the prospect of millions of people having their webcams monitored off of a mainstream commercial service like Yahoo would have resulted in front-page stories and an outcry that would have gone on for a lengthy period of time, as I think many people would have scarcely believed the notion that what they thought were private video conversations, many of them involving sexually explicit images, would have generated a huge outcry. And yet this was, at best, a one-day story, one in which it attracted certainly some attention in the UK, attracted a little bit of attention elsewhere, but certainly not front-page headlines, certainly not major headlines at all. Instead, this was just yet one more of the myriad of stories that we have seen since the first Snowden leaks last June. And I think that there is, or at least there ought to be, a real concern for those that have concerns around these issues, that there is already fatigue when it comes to just the almost non-stop tidal wave of disclosures of what is taking place. Indeed, if you listen to what Glenn Greenwald has said, one of the lead reporters who has been working with Snowden on these issues, and consider that there's roughly about major disclosure per week, it would seem, or at least there has been since last June. We're told that this can go on, based on the amount of material that they have, for about 40 years. There is so much stuff that Snowden took, and so much stuff that is to be examined by people like Barton Gellman and Glenn Greenwald and others, that we are talking about potentially decades of disclosures. Now, I'm not sure that this is going to go on for decades in this way, but just the sheer volume of documents, of programs that are apparently out there, leads me to believe that it's possible that we can go in a couple of different directions. And one, of course, would be the direction that we've seen, I suppose, in the United States to a certain extent, a scaling back of some of these programs where the sunshine on this suggests that there are problems, while on the other hand, there is the possibility that we simply get fatigue on the public and gradual acceptance of many of these programs, as it just seems so overwhelming as to suggest that there is little that can be done. Now, I think in a room like this, I don't have to go through just those myriad of disclosures, but as I'm sure many of you will know, this ranges from everything from the phone records, which were some of the early disclosures in which the Obama administration is now addressing most directly. We've, of course, had the PRISM programs, the programs dealing with the internet-based companies, that is still having, and we'll talk a bit more about it in a few minutes, serious ramifications when it comes to how people perceive cloud computing, how they perceive companies like Google and Microsoft and Facebook and many others that we entrust much of our personal information to, that we engage from a computing perspective in many, many different ways. And yet we now learn that the NSA has a wide range of access, or has had a wide range of access to much of this information, raising real questions, not just about that access, but also about the role that some of these companies have played in facilitating that access, or at least supporting it directly, or in some instances indirectly. We know we're talking about huge numbers of email records over time, said to include content, and this is important as well, because one of the first responses, and I'd like to talk a bit about this a little bit later as well. One of the first responses that we often get around some of these issues is to say, don't worry, we're not actually talking about the content here, we're just talking about the metadata. We're talking, as many will know, the data about data. I think increasingly that's a distinction without a difference, and we've had many, many studies that have pointed to the informational value of metadata and what that can mean and what that can disclose, such that in some instances it can be more revealing than the content of the messages themselves. But to the extent to which there has been this attempt to create a division or a clear line between, on the one hand, the metadata on the one side, the content on the other, we now know that content has been fair game in some of these instances with some of these surveillance programs as well. We know that there is massive amounts spent on this, all of this in a sense in a black box, as you see here. Very little is disclosed about how this money is spent, the oversight, and we'll talk about this in great detail in a few minutes. The oversight over some of this also, I think, in the view of many, sorely lacking. We also know, and we'll come to Canada's role here, we know there are attempts to try to cover much of this up directly even within the U.S. Congress, as well as real participation between the United States and the so-called Five Eyes, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. There's, of course, spying on allies, which has had serious political repercussions in some places, and raised real questions about that. And then, as I mentioned a moment ago, the question of who pays for all of this. And in some instances, both in Britain, as you can see here, but also in Canada, the notion that the NSA in the United States is funding many of these programs, not just its own programs, but funding some of the Canadian and foreign programs as well. In fact, you can look at the CSEC budget, and you can see there is a line item for revenues that are coming in from outside of the country. It's quite clear that those revenues are indeed the NSA picking up the tab for some of the activities that our Canadian authorities may be engaged in. Troublingly, I think, for many, many, and I'm sure for many in the room, was not just the surveillance programs themselves, but the efforts to undermine some of the encryption standards that are out there as well. And here Canada, I think it's important to emphasize, played a role as well. So in standard-setting bodies where Canada is or was at the time the chair of the program, of that standard-setting committee, the NSA worked to create backdoors within some of those encryption standards, and it was Canada sitting there as the chair of that committee that helped facilitate some of those kinds of activities. Undermining, I think, not just the encryption standard itself, and I think confidence, both business confidence, security confidence, and perhaps public confidence in some of these standards, but I think also in the process itself. The notion that somehow these standards processes were above this sort of activity, that it was necessary to ensure that everyone was confident in it, and yet we now learn that there were efforts to undermine or at least create backdoors there as well. And so this, I think, very disturbing and very troubling. I've alluded to it already a little bit, but it's worth pausing for a moment just to emphasize that there is a Canadian side to the story. I think it's fair to say that at times Canadians have wanted to see ourselves as saying, well, that may be what the Americans are doing, or perhaps what's taking place in the UK, but somehow that CSEC, that our own agencies were acting somewhat differently. We now know, based on many of the disclosures, that that is not the case, that we are an active and in some instances enthusiastic participant, collaborator in many of these kinds of activities. In fact, some of the kinds of documents that have come out suggest that there's almost an aims to please kind of thing, where Canadians become actively involved in this and want to demonstrate their bona fides to others. The starting point in Canada here is also a metadata program. And so I think it's very notable to see efforts to move back in the United States now, potentially anyway, from that bulk collection of phone records and the use of metadata, whereas by contrast in Canada right now, we know we have a widespread metadata program. Unlike in the United States, we don't know the full contours or details of what's taking place here. We know that there has been controversy within CSEC about the legality of this program as it was approved, and there were concerns expressed, and so it was briefly, it would appear, put on hiatus, but then restarted and still in operation today under a ministerial authorization at the time from the minister then, Peter MacKay. And so we know this is taking place, and we know this is largely how the government justifies many of the leaks and disclosures that have come out about Canadian activity and participation in some of these issues over the last few months. When we hear officials say that Canada is acting fully within the current state of the law, what they are saying is, in many instances, that they are operating within the law because they have been given the direct approval through the ministerial authorization to collect metadata. It's a discussion, a debate that we haven't seen in Parliament. It's one that we haven't seen within the public to decide for ourselves whether or not metadata ought to be treated in the way that it is being treated right now by the government, and we have seen some disclosures and some media attention, although keeping pace with this. And from a Canadian perspective, given the lack of disclosures, has been difficult. We also, of course, know Canada plays an active role on the spying side. I suppose that doesn't come as a particular surprise, although what may be notable, I think, to many is that many of the activities are believed to be at the behest of the United States. And so it's not clear what the Canadian national interest is in some of these instances, but nevertheless our agencies are actively engaged, both abroad as well as has been revealed in Canada as well. Canada allowing the NSA to spy both at the G8 and the G20 summits that took place a couple of years ago in Toronto. And so Canada playing an active role, as I say, a collaborator as part of that Five Eyes. The story that perhaps generated the most amount of attention, often described as an airport Wi-Fi story, although I don't really think that that was the gist or the key part of the story. It wasn't really about airport Wi-Fi, but rather it was about the collection of much of this metadata and then using that data in different ways, including in this one program's instance trying to combine that information with information gleaned from at least one airport Wi-Fi terminal and other Wi-Fi hotspots to try to identify travel patterns and the like. But this was really all about the ability to mine information that's already been collected more than the collection of new data that's taken place. And troublingly, and again we'll come back to this in a few minutes, the oversight that exists within Canada from the CSEC Commissioner and from others, I think in the view of many has been sorely lacking. So we know Canada is an active participant in all of this. We know that we're playing an important role. We also, I think, increasingly have real questions about the kind of oversight that we have over it. Now, all of this, and this is, I think, also not particularly new to anyone, is having, in a sense, a Snowden snowball effect. It's had real-world implications, so that even if the conversation itself is sporadic and perhaps still not as widespread as it might otherwise be, the impact has been fairly dramatic in a number of different places. It's certainly had a big business impact, and for those that operate or deal with some of the larger players, you'll be well aware that this has been happening. And I think it's notable that the problems have continued, which may in part help to explain why there is now this shift or potential shift in U.S. policy. So for example, this slide shot here, taken back in December, when many of the major technology companies traveled to Washington to meet with the president to express concern that over the prior 6 months, the Snowden revelations had had a significant impact on their business, as many started to talk about data localization, about the need, in their view, to shift away from some of the cloud-based services, or at a minimum mandate that the data be stored locally, or increasingly distrust U.S. technologies in much the same way that we've seen technologies from other countries, China and the like, distrusted. Some of the same kind of distrust now on some of the U.S. technologies for the very reasons that would be obvious given what we've just talked about. Things like the undermining some of the encryption standards, questions about whether or not U.S. companies can be trusted, and the role that the U.S. government might be playing with some of those companies in the background. Now that was back in December. By last week, the same companies were back again, and again expressing real concern. In fact, talking about how some now are spending billions of dollars in an effort to try to assuage the concern that they are seeing in other jurisdictions, and so they are setting up those local data facilities in some instances. In other instances, they are finding that they are not winning contracts or that they are excluded from potential contracts altogether. And so this has had, from a business perspective, a clear snowballing effect and may help explain where the pressure is coming from, not necessarily from civil liberties and privacy groups that have been really concerned about these issues, but instead, in part from the business community that is seeing a real bottom line impact when it comes to some of these issues. The most obvious place on that business side is with cloud computing. You'll know that many companies have pointed to cloud computing as what they see as really the sort of, if not the future of computing, one that provides great value in terms of efficiency, in terms of cost, in terms of the ability for consumers, for convenience purposes, in terms of the ability to access their material anywhere and everywhere. And yet this has had a real dampening effect, I think, in public confidence, both on the consumer level as well as some on the business level, especially if you're a business that is engaged in an area where your information needs to be secure. You may have certain obligations from a security perspective as well. This raising huge issues, whether we're talking about Google or otherwise. Some countries considering mandated localization in terms of requiring that there be local storage facilities. This on top of things like the Patriot Act in the United States, all of which has made, in the view of some, the United States, or at least storing data in the United States, feel like a no-go, and real concerns for some about the privacy implications of all of that. And so businesses are talking about the impact that this is having for them on a global basis. I think it's notable that there is a Canadian side to this story as well. And I did a column on this fairly recently that talked about documents that were obtained by the BC FIPA, the Freedom of Information organization based in British Columbia, that was looking at the federal government's in Canada, the federal government's effort to move to a single email service. You may know at the moment the government has had, or up until recently, the government has had about 100 different email systems. There has been an effort to consolidate that with a large RFP that was put out a year or two ago for that single email system. One of the requirements that the government established within that was data localization, that the email had to be, servers and the data storage had to be located in Canada. That created real objections from U.S.-based providers. And the documents that were obtained by the BC organization were actually U.S.-based documents. Here's a couple of them. U.S.-based documents, not Canadian-based ones. And so this is coming out of the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative Office, which is responsible for addressing some of the trade issues in the United States, where many of the affected U.S. companies were looking for, if not retaliation, to at a minimum escalate the issue, to express concern that they were effectively being excluded from the process. You take a look at towards the bottom there. I'm not sure how clear you can see all of this, but hopefully you can note that there was even raised within the United States the possibility, what if the Canadian customers are able to encrypt the data in Canada, keep the keys in Canada, even if the storage is itself in the United States. But the Canadian RFP was emphatic about the need for a complete Canadian localization of all of this. Why was all of this taking place? The document suggests that the Canadian government itself was expressing concern around privacy, in this case, the USA Patriot Act. And so we're seeing that implication play out here in Canada, and of course, it wouldn't be a surprise to find that some Canadians may increasingly ask that if it's not good enough for their own government in terms of where the data is being stored, why should it be good enough for them on a personal level? And so the cloud computing impact is important, not just, I think, for those U.S. organizations, but we've seen it play out to a certain extent here in Canada as well. We're seeing, and this is taking place also in real time, it play out from an internet governance perspective. And so one of the initial responses, one of the early responses that we saw from a number of countries to these revelations was to say, hold on a second, if this network is the way it is, and you are in a sense hoovering up so much of this information as it traverses the network, we're going to seek to create our own network, a so-called balkanized internet. that may not interoperate in the way that we've become accustomed, and which is, of course, so important for the way the Internet functions. That quickly seeps over to questions about who governs the Internet. And you may know that that issue of Internet governance, where we're talking about the domain name system, talking about the IP address allocation and the like, the sort of that plumbing, in a sense, of the Internet, currently managed by ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. It's a U.S.-based nonprofit under contract to the United States. And so there are root servers located around the world, but the majority of them are in the United States. And the organization that nominally has control over that, ICANN, is itself responds to the United States. This has been the subject of some controversy and concern, I think, from a lot of other governments. Some of the governments are governments that many of us would not have much sympathies for. And so when governments like China, Saudi Arabia, or others talk about their desire for greater control over the Internet, I think that sends alarm bells for many. And so that in prior years, where there were efforts to try to seize back or try to bring some amount of control out of the United States into a more global international community, sometimes through UN organizations like the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, sometimes in other ways, there's often been a lot of pushback from, certainly, of course, from the United States, but also from Canada, from many European countries, and others that may not love the current ICANN U.S.-sponsored model, but say that it's the best of the available options. And yet, in light of Snowden, I think, despite the fact that this area of domain name management and allocation and the like, is not one where there's any obvious link to the kind of surveillance that we're seeing. This has become a touch point instead because, of course, the role that the U.S. has played in that regard. And over the last 2 weeks, the United States has announced that it plans to give up control over ICANN, or at least over what's called the IANA functions that are core to some of the ways that the Internet itself functions. There's been an interesting response to that, with some in the United States seeing this as a political issue, one in which they don't believe the U.S. should surrender control. But the U.S. has, by coming forward on this, really seized the agenda. Actually, my column this week talks specifically about this. Seized the agenda by setting some of the terms and conditions for this, including saying it will not give transfer control over to a body like the United Nations. Instead, they are calling for a multi-stakeholder approach, one in which there is a role for many different stakeholders. And literally right now, it's been this week in Singapore at an ICANN meeting, there has been much discussion around what this might look like. I think there's some reason to think that the U.S. isn't giving up as much control as it lets on, but nevertheless, what had been sort of a somewhat contentious issue over Internet governance for the better part of a decade or more really found its trigger point for change with Snowden as well. So it's amazing to see that play out. It's playing out in trade negotiations too. Canada is involved in negotiations, in several trade negotiations, including the TPP, which stands for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It is a major trade negotiations that includes Canada, the United States, Mexico, Peru, and a few other Latin American countries, as well as most notably from Asia, Japan, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, all participants in the TPP negotiations. There's been a lot of talk in TPP around things like intellectual property rules, but there is also a privacy element here, with much debate over whether or not the TPP will include a provision that will bar the use of mandated data localization. And so this issue of Snowden to then where is my data being stored is now moving into the world of trade negotiations as countries battle over whether or not a country ought to have the right to mandate data localization, or should free flow of data, the ability to store wherever, be something that gets included in one of these trade deals. And that's still an issue that is up for discussion right now. There's, of course, encryption. One of the, I think, the interesting things as well out of all of this is that many of the larger companies, the Googles, Microsofts, and Facebooks, were somewhat reluctant to fully embrace encryption across all of their products, noting the additional costs, in a sense, associated with doing so. And yet, once it became increasingly clear that they too were a target for much of this, that data transfers between, let's say, one Google server farm and another Google server farm was itself seen as a weak point and an ability for the NSA to capture much of that information. We have now seen many of the larger internet companies that are so popular with internet users moving towards increased security, increased encryption in a way that prior to Snowden they were somewhat reticent to do, in part because of the costs associated with it, now seeing the potential costs of not being able to provide their customer base with some real assurances are increasingly moving away. And those same companies, some of which were somewhat reluctant to embrace full transparency about what they were doing, have now also seen the need to do that too. And so what started with Google Transparency Report several years ago, you can find these online. They focus on requests that they have received from a wide range of countries, including Canada. Take a look both in terms of takedown notices as well as requests for data, as well as orders from courts. These have assumed a heightened importance, even as we, to a certain extent, have less faith in some of those transparency reports because many of the kinds of activities that have been disclosed weren't included within them. And so what's happened over the last number of months, here you can see Facebook's transparency reporting mechanism, and there are a number of others, is that companies that on the one may have been reluctant to embrace this, and Facebook is actually an example of that. They were slower than some of their competitors to adopt transparency reports, have now moved to provide those. Here's one from from Twitter, I think it was. So we've seen a bunch of companies do that, and what we have also seen is those companies lobby the U.S. government to allow them to better disclose what's taking place on the surveillance side, national security side. So an about face when it comes to talking about transparency and what's taking place within those organizations. So if we look at all of that, and as you may have seen, we're going to come to legal in a moment, but if you look at all of that, the business implications, the cloud computing and encryption implications, the trade implications, the broader internet governance implications that this has had, and even the way the organizations themselves run and interact now from a transparency perspective. It is incredible, I think, really, to see how much impact one person has had through these disclosures in what is less than a year. And so when I start by saying, listen, the conversation has changed, it clearly has at a certain level. Within those directly concerned, grappling with these kinds of issues, it is a new world, and we have seen many, many changes, and this is still an issue that has yet to fully play out, but I think we're better understanding now just how broad-based the activities are, and the response itself has been, I think, quite dramatic. Which brings me to, in a sense, my area. So it took me a little while, but eventually you knew you'd get there. Law professor's got to talk about the law, which is another area that I want to make the case for change, although I think it's fair to say that change here has been slower than it has been in some of the other areas. So we can see that the private sector is shifting and moving in response to this, sometimes simply out of a business imperative to try to respond to some of these issues on the law side, which is dependent less on, of course, the private sector and more, of course, on government to change some of the rules that governs these activities. The pace of change has been far slower. So we get some of the announcements that I highlighted earlier on from the United States. We've seen really nothing from Canada at all. And I want to drill down a little bit more into the kinds of changes and try to make the case that it's not just about oversight in terms of improving oversight, but that we need to be thinking a little bit about the substance from a surveillance law perspective in Canada too. So it is the case, though, that these laws are increasingly being scrutinized in the United States. It's not just that the Obama administration is moving away from this, or at least some of its activities, but there have been a number of cases launched with differing outcomes. In one instance, we had a U.S. court hold that these activities were illegal. In another instance, the activities themselves were upheld. There seems to be a fair amount of certainty that these cases will ultimately go to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so this is an issue that will go to the highest court in the United States to examine these activities and try to provide a better understanding of how constitutional protections in the United States interface with both the need, certainly the need for national security, but also the way in which some of these programs have developed. And I also think that we can expect that one of the things that will come out of that is the need for the NSA and U.S. government and others to make the case that these programs have been effective. One of the most striking things about one of the U.S. cases is that the judge came to the conclusion that the government had been unable to really make a convincing case that these programs, invasive as they are, were not having a significant impact in terms of making anyone really safer. And they had a hard time pointing to specific examples of how the programs themselves have been effective. I think we can look for that to continue to be one of the real linchpin issues in terms of trying to identify whether or not these programs are seen as legally reasonable. Part of it will be whether or not they actually are doing anything in terms of the goals. There is, again, a Canadian angle here too. This is an op-ed that I jointly wrote together with a series of other law professors from across the country, pointing to the fact that even in the United States, Canadians have a specific issue because the protections that we enjoy are less than the protections that those in the United States enjoy in the U.S. because of the differences in constitutional protections. And so same data in terms of all of that data being collected and accessed by the United States, and yet when it comes to the level of privacy protection or constitutional protections that information enjoys, if you are a resident or citizen in the United States, you get one kind of protections. If you are from elsewhere, you get another. And in fact, if you'll recall some of the early hearings on this in the United States, one of the attempts to assure the U.S. public that they had little reason for concern was the argument that they had certain kinds of protections. Don't worry, this is all about foreigners. This is all about people outside the United States. When they're talking about us too. Talking about Canadians here being sort of outside of that tent, enjoying less protection. And this piece tried to make the argument that we need to be pressuring the United States not just to perhaps change some of its rules, but in the absence of that change, at a minimum, change the kinds of protections that it affords not just to its own citizens, but also to those outside, because Canadians and others enjoy less and less protection. And so that's the U.S. side. From a Canadian side, we've seen a lot of talk about the need for better oversight. And I'll talk a little bit in a couple of minutes about what that Canadian oversight looks like. But I wanted to pause here just to note how oversight in some instances can be critically important. So I don't want to dismiss oversight altogether. I'll give you an example. Would be the debate or the fight over lawful access. This is, you may recall the government's efforts to include both new surveillance capabilities within network providers as well as create the new mandatory requirement to disclose personal information by internet providers and other intermediaries as part of an investigation without court oversight. This was an issue that back in 2012 attracted a lot of attention. You may recall the government introduced what they called the Protecting Children from Internet Predators Act, despite the fact that the bill, which was about 100 pages long, only referenced children once. So it wasn't really about dealing with Internet predators and protecting kids. It was more fundamentally about creating these lawful access powers, the surveillance capabilities within network providers, the mandated disclosure of personal information, as well as the creation of a series of new warrants. You may recall, and it's perhaps the most infamous aspect of this attempted piece of legislation, where critics started talking about it, knew it was coming the day before it was introduced in the House of Commons. There was comments raised during question period about it, and the public safety minister at the time, Vic Tays, someone quite infamously stated that you could either stand with us or stand with the child pornographers, suggesting that if you were somehow against this legislation or critical of the legislation, you were somehow in favor of child pornography or at least supportive of child pornographers. It turned out when presented with that choice, a great many Canadians said, okay, I'll take the child pornographers, as we had tens of thousands, if not in some instances over hundreds of thousands of Canadians find different ways to speak out. Sites like Open Media site. This page here actually comes from the Ontario Privacy Commissioner, Anne Kabukian, similarly trying to drum up concern about where things were going. This came from the opposition Liberal Party at the time, doing much the same kind of things. So we saw lots and lots of activity. We saw people blogging about it, saw the power of social media to raise more awareness of this. In fact, some of the campaigns I thought that were most interesting and in a sense most effective were true grassroots-oriented campaigns. My favorite by far was the Tell Vic Everything campaign, which some of you may recall. This was a Twitter effort in which many concluded that if the government was going to engage in surveillance, you might as well tell it everything anyway. And so somewhat cheekily, people would send out tweets with the hashtag #TellVicEverything, everything from what I had for breakfast this morning to a range of other things, saying the government's going to capture it anyway as part of its new surveillance capabilities. My favorite by far was this tweet here. Hey, AtlSecCon, I lost an email from my work account yesterday. Can I get your copy? Which I thought was, it's amazing what you can do in 140 characters. And this was, terrifically effective, both in conveying a message about what wasn't really taking place, but nevertheless where some of those concerns were. And I think it's notable. I think this went up on a Wednesday as this sort of took hold. And on Saturday, Vic Tays was interviewed on CBC's program, The House, and he was asked about the campaign, and he said that he found it funny. But of course, if you're a politician and they're laughing at you rather than with you, you know that you've got a problem. And so in the case of lawful access, within a week and a half, the government announced that it was going to hit the pause button on this, and so that it wasn't going to move forward, at least at that time, with the legislation. And a year later, it made the commitment to kill the online surveillance bill. Now, I raise all of this in part because much of the fear and concern around lawful access was around oversight. It wasn't to say that it may not be appropriate in some instances to have some of these powers, but that if you're going to get subscriber information, being able to obtain that on a mandated basis, required basis to disclose without any court oversight, I think struck many people as deeply problematic. Now, the government made a commitment at that point in time to say it wasn't going to move forward with this legislation. You can see any attempts that we'll have to continue to modernize the criminal code will not contain the measures contained in C-30. That commitment lasted less than a year. As the new Justice Minister, Peter MacKay, having shifted now into Justice, announced a number of months ago a new piece of legislation, although it is much like the old piece of legislation. It is marketed differently now. It is now about child bullying as opposed to child endangerment. And there are a couple of provisions in what is about a 70-page bill. I think it's about 3 pages that deal with child bullying. The remainder of the bill is lawful access. There are some things that have been removed from the prior bill, but nevertheless, much of the concerns many of the concerns that were raised in the prior bill are back again. Apologies for all the text here, but you can see that it does create a whole series of new warrants, and it's important to recognize those new warrants, of course, mean that there is court oversight. There is what's referred to as a transmission data warrant. That's effectively metadata. And so a new warrant that more easily can be used to more easily access metadata at various providers. There's a number of standards that are built in, but what's I think quite important here is that it is a reason to suspect standard, a reasonable suspicion standard that law enforcement would have to meet for this warrant. That is a lower standard than what we would typically find for most other warrants. And so what the government is saying is that metadata is less of a concern, enjoys less privacy protection than other kinds of issues. I think many who study this issue say that's just not right, but that's nevertheless what they've established. They are also establishing, if this becomes law, new preservation and production orders. And so the vision is the ability to go in, obtain the metadata on a low standard that as part of that investigation, then obtain orders that require internet providers or other intermediaries to preserve certain information, and then ultimately, of course, to produce it as part of that, or turn it over as part of that investigation. So that's part of C-13 rather. The other part of this bill that a lot of people have started to talk about is immunity from liability for disclosure. And so the way the law works now is that if you are, let's say, an internet provider, an ISP, and law enforcement comes to you and says, I'd like, or whoever comes to, law enforcement or another agency comes to you and says, can you provide me some information about a subscriber information? I don't have a warrant at this stage, but this is part of a lawful, this is part of an investigation. They have the right to disclose without court oversight. They also have the right to say, no, come back with a warrant. What this bill would do would be to remove one of the reasons that some ISPs might say no, and that, of course, would be fear of liability. In this instance, the law would say any of these disclosures, we will create immunity from any civil liability, any criminal liability. So if you hand this over, you've got no fear of any further liability. As part of this, in a sense, removing the likelihood of the oversight mechanisms that otherwise are out there. In fact, we already know that internet providers are handing over subscriber information without a warrant tens of thousands of times every year. Information that I had obtained a couple of years ago through the Access to Information System found that the RCMP, just on reportedly on child cases, had asked for and obtained subscriber information almost 30,000 times in a year. But we now know that it is spread far wider, because actually just this week, just 2 days ago, new information was tabled in the House of Commons. This is a piece from the Halifax paper, actually, that talks about how a number of other government departments have also revealed that they have been asking for this information and been obtaining it on a routine or regular basis. As an example, the CBSA, the Canadian Border Services Agency, in the prior year had almost 19,000 requests for subscriber information. And I must admit, I was talking to Paul McLeod, the journalist here, and it's not entirely clear why Border Services needs this information almost 20,000 times in a single year, but they've been asking for it. They obtained warrants 52 times out of that almost 19,000. In every other instance, they simply asked for the information, and in all but 25 cases, they got exactly what they were asking for. ISPs handing over this information without court oversight tens of thousands of times every year. And so admittedly, it's already there, and this law would help immunize all of that. Just so you know where it's at, just yesterday, a lot of this is happening in real time, just yesterday the government moved to what's known as time allocation on this bill in an effort to try to move that forward faster. So it's going to go to committee in the next number of weeks, and the government has made clear that it wants to put it on a fast track. So we're seeing this area move, and I think all of this highlights how oversight is important. And so I wouldn't want anyone to walk away thinking that oversight is not necessary. The question that I think ought to be asked is whether oversight alone is good enough, and I don't think it is, especially when we talk about some of these surveillance-related activities. So if we think of CSEC, which would be Canada's counterpart to the NSA, its mandate, and this is often discussed, has a three-part mandate. The mandate to acquire information from the global information infrastructure for foreign intelligence purposes, to provide guidance on securing Canada's networks, and to provide technical and operational assistance to other Canadian law enforcement agencies. You'll note there that and this is straight out of the law, that activities carried out under Parts A and B of the mandate, that global surveillance and that guidance should not be directed at Canadians or people in Canada, and is subject to Canadian privacy law. So that's the mandate. The mandate is that this is supposed to be taking place outside of the jurisdiction, and there are real restrictions there. The oversight, such that it is for those CSEC activities, in a sense, I think boils down largely to three sources. One is a CSEC commissioner, and so there is a commissioner who is entitled to fully review CSEC's programs, its activities, and issues reports on it. There have been some amounts of criticism in the last number of months about the effectiveness of the CSEC commissioner, the sense that the CSEC commissioner operates within that broad CSEC tent and isn't able to really affect the sort of change that some would like. There is also concern that on some of the more controversial or contentious issues, the CSEC commissioner has been very slow in operating. So for example, there has been a promised report on the metadata issue for years and years and years, one that has not been forthcoming. So we put a lot of faith, at least under the Canadian framework, in the CSEC Commissioner. There are two other sources of oversight. One is the federal court, and so it may be, especially for the Part C of that mandate, the mandate in terms of assistance that CSEC might provide, let's say, to CSIS, where it would go to the federal, or the RCMP, it would go to the federal court, and then the minister has to provide, in some instances, authorization for some of the activities. That brings us back to where what I was talking about a little earlier, that notion of ministerial authorizations, and the idea that that lies in the minister to provide authorization. The question for a lot of people is that, is this good enough? Is having this CSEC Commissioner, the federal court, and the minister good enough from an oversight perspective? Even the courts themselves have expressed concern. And so in a recent decision from the federal court actually, the judge there read the CSEC Commissioner's report, saw some of the concerns about activities as between CSIS and CSEC, and realized that this involved a case that he had been involved with in terms of providing an authorization for certain surveillance activities, and felt ultimately that he had been misled in terms of the information that the intelligence agencies had provided to the court in order to obtain the approvals that they were seeking. So we've even got the federal court, or at least judges within the federal court, expressing some concern around some of this. But I think it's a bigger issue than even just these kinds of court cases. I think there is no doubt, and lawful access points to it, but we could look at the ministerial authorization and others and say that, you know what, we need to think about the kind of oversight framework that we have, and we have to do better, because when we look at the scope of the activities that are taking place, there is real reason for concern. But I think that if we only deal with oversight, if we only say, okay, we're going to put in this new layer of oversight, let's say a parliamentary oversight, some other kind of mechanism that people ensure that these activities, or attempt to ensure that these activities are all operating within the confines of the law, if we don't change what those confines of the law look like, I think there's a real, I don't know that we're going to solve many of the problems. And so metadata is, to me, the perfect example of all of this. As I mentioned earlier, when Canadian officials, from CSEC and otherwise, look at the reports around what is, as I mentioned, described as airport Wi-Fi, those kinds of surveillance capabilities, and seek to assure the public that this is operating fully within the law. And the CSEC Commissioner does the same. And so after some of the initial reports, we had both CSEC and the CSEC Commissioner and the Minister all say, look, nothing to see here, move along, this is all perfectly lawful. The reason that they are able to say this is perfectly lawful is because metadata is being treated in the manner that it is, one in which it can be bulk collected and data mined. And the view is that it is not sufficiently privacy invasive and doesn't raise the issues necessary for specific kinds of reviews. Instead, we've got a general ministerial authorization for a program that allows for broad collection of metadata, further broad data mining of that same information, and all of this is purportedly legal. Now, I suggest to you that if all we do is improve oversight, all we will be left with is yet another person to say, to tick the box in a sense and say, sure, we reviewed it also, it's legal within the structure of the law. We need to have, I think, a more open conversation about what is taking place from a metadata perspective, and recognize that if there are concerns, and as I say, I think many experts who have looked at this say there are reasons for concern, one of the things that we seek to do is change some of the ground rules under which metadata gets collected and used. Not just metadata, though. Jurisdiction would be another. I pointed a moment ago to the CSEC mandate and this notion that somehow it takes place outside of Canada. Part A and Part B, not targeted at Canadians or within Canada. U.S., it's the same thing, which is why they say, Americans, people in the U.S. say, you've got better protection. It's everybody else that we're targeting. And yet I think, especially for people expert in how networks run and function, you'll know that this notion that we can so easily separate out network activity on a jurisdictional basis is increasingly a fiction. In Canada, we know that we have very few IXPs, Internet Exchange Points, of where the data actually transfers. We know that if you're on the Bell network, you're transferring to another ISP, you're transferring, essentially exchanging data in Chicago. as they don't exchange even within the country. In many other instances, the data is going outside the country, coming back into the country, easily accessed by network providers, as well as, of course, stored in some instances by network providers. And so this idea that we can provide assurances that if you're in Canada, you're off limits, and if you're outside Canada, that's what we're really trying to target. I think the agencies themselves increasingly acknowledge that that's not the case. They know, they say that, you know, there may be incidental Canadian collection as part of the activity that takes place. I would suggest that it is far more than that. Canadians' data is often going to be captured, if not by Canadian authorities, then certainly by others. This notion that somehow we can neatly divide out the network map in the same way that we divide out the geographic map and then layer on legal rules that say this is how it works is a fiction that might be designed to provide people with some amount of assurance, but I don't think that it really does. So too with data sharing issues, a third area where the assurances that we get from security agencies, certainly in Canada and elsewhere, is that yes, say within Five Eyes, within the groups of Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, we actively share and work together. But what we don't do, the assurances often are, is that we don't operate on behalf of somebody else. So we don't ask someone to do something that we ourselves would be prohibited or precluded from doing. I think when we take a look, especially in light of Snowden, at the degree to which there is this level of cooperation, this almost parceling out of responsibilities and assignments, even with different money flows in terms of who pays for some of this stuff, concerns around real-world data sharing that may exist between these agencies, I think is a very legitimate and very real concern. So we've got laws, we've got this oversight mechanism that says, okay, we're going to ensure that everything is on side with the law. But then once you get into the tough issue, metadata, jurisdiction, and data sharing, you quickly find that the laws themselves don't provide the level of protection that one needs, and all the oversight in the world isn't going to fix that. And so that's why I really wanted to sort of the core message at the end of the day, aside from taking a look at all the different changes that are taking place, is one to suggest that as we think about how we strike the balance in Canada between appropriate levels of security and at the same time appropriate levels of privacy, how do we ensure that we have what in some instances is clearly necessary, but at the same time do it in a way that the public doesn't feel that they are being caught up, almost assumed to be guilty in a sense, rather than targeting those where there are real sources of concern. We've got to look at oversight, but it's not alone sufficient. So I'd conclude by saying that the conversation may be changing, and I think there are some positives out there, but the law needs to as well. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. I've run a bit long, well not long, but almost that full hour, but I'm happy to answer any questions or engage in any discussion if you like. Thanks very much.
Anybody have any questions for Michael? No? All right, so I guess we'll, oh, we got one. Excellent. He's running off that mic, so.
Hi, Michael. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can.
My name is Henry Stern, and I work with Farsight Security. What would you offer as advice to those of us who collect data for security purposes regarding all the privacy implications that you just brought up?
Right. Well, what I would say, and I'm sure this is something that many of you will have heard before, but when Canada first established some of its privacy rules, I think the security side of the story was severely underestimated. And so if we think back, and it's actually roughly the 10-year anniversary now of the establishment of private sector privacy legislation to take broad effect, there were many that thought this is all just about having a privacy policy. So in a sense, tell people what you're going to do and then do it. And so long as you do that, you're okay. what I think we quickly learned was that that was only the start of the responsibility. It really wasn't the end point of it. And the security side of the equation was, in many instances, the most challenging part, and I think in the view of many, probably the most important part. Because once you've collected that information, of course, it's your responsibility now not just to have told people what you're going to do, but to ensure that it enjoys an adequate level, an appropriate level of security. Now, you're the experts from a security side in terms of what that necessarily entails, but I think some of the best practices, of course, that we've seen include things like limiting the collection to what is strictly necessary, and that's, the law would require that as well, but that's in your best interest as well from the security perspective. Flushing the data once it's no longer necessary and no longer usable or needs to be used, of course, there too, because if you get hacked, if the data itself is gone, the concerns themselves are decreased. And then there's, of course, developing policies for those instances, should those instances occur, where there is a breach. And we're starting to see different rules around this issue. In fact, I'm reliably told that the government will be introducing private sector privacy reform in Canada probably within the next number of months. And what we can expect within that bill will be new security breach disclosure requirements. And so it's not just good practice to have policies in place to address the prospect of what happens should there be a breach in terms of appropriate levels of notification and remediation around that data, but it is likely to become the law probably within the next year or so. So let's assume if the bill gets introduced by let's say sometime in the spring, there's an election scheduled by the fall of 2015, we can expect that if the government wants to follow through on the commitment, it will have that bill go through the parliamentary process and pass it before the election. So sometime by the summer of 2015, I think it's reasonably likely we're going to see mandatory security breach legislation in Canada. So this is an issue that, you know, to the extent to which some people may have been sort of leaving it to the side, saying, you know what, of course I'm going to do everything I can to ensure that I've got an appropriate level of security, but I'm not really going to turn attention to sort of those worst-case scenarios of what happens if there is a breach, what happens if a hard drive goes missing. We saw just this week the Privacy Commissioner's report on the HRDC breach, where I think it was just a Seagate external drive containing data on 600,000 people went missing. So we know these things happen. I will tell you sort of as a forewarning that there is the likelihood that this is going to become the law. And so whether you're someone that works directly with organizations on their security needs or you're within an organization with security responsibility, it's an issue that is going to take, I think, an increasing amount of import, and people are going to start looking to and saying, okay, what exactly do I need to do? What sort of policies do I need in place? Because where one of these breaches happens, you've got to be in a position to act quickly, both in terms of trying to address the concerns, but also what will increasingly become address your legal obligations as well.
Hi, Michael. It's Andrew here. We have one more question for you from an audience member. His name's David Shipley. We're not amplified up front, so if you wouldn't mind, once David asks you your question, repeating it so that the rest of the audience. Fantastic. Thank you. David Shipley.
Hi, Michael. Thanks. My question is, in terms of universities in Canada, they kind of fall in a hybrid place where they could be considered a network, like a company or an ISP. How do you think Bill C-13 is going to affect universities and colleges in Canada?
Okay, great question. So the question, for those that weren't able to hear it, focused specifically on Canadian universities and colleges. And they, of course, provide network services. Questions about whether or not they might fall within the ambit of Bill C-13, because on the one hand, they, of course, feel like an ISP, certainly within their community, but don't function entirely like an ISP in other situations. The answer to that is that C-13 has excluded, and prior bills have tried to exclude ISPs, universities, from the ambit of some of the network provider requirements. So the requirements that previously existed in lawful access about surveillance capabilities, those always excluded universities. They excluded universities, so the recognition that they weren't going to add universities to that. In terms of some of the other obligations, though, those are broad-based obligations. And so the mandatory disclosure, the warrantless disclosure immunity, that applies to everybody. And so too, of course, the warrants. And so the warrants in C13 around metadata, around production orders and preservation orders, that applies to university administrators, university networks, in the same way that it would apply to any other network provider. So in that sense, obviously, if you're served with one of these, you'll face the same kinds of requirements, although it raises some interesting issues, certainly on a metadata context. If you could see, say, faculty associations sort of raise issues around their freedom of speech and tenure issues and those sorts of things to sort of raise questions as to whether or not that represents an impingement on that. But these are legal rules that are broad-based, and the one place where university networks were excluded in the past have not been, sort of is no longer a core part of the legislation, and so broad-based requirements apply to everyone.
Are there any other questions for Mike? Oh, we have one more. This will be our last one. We're getting close on time. Want to give you guys a break and then roll into the next presentation and jump into lunch. This is one of our good friends, Michael. His name's Michael Doherty, and he has a question for you.
Sure.
Hi. So you mentioned that mandatory notification for data breaches was probably coming down the pipe. Is there anything in terms of mandatory notification for security vulnerabilities? I suspect the answer is probably no. So do you think that's a good idea?
Well, that's a really great question. So for those that weren't able to hear it, Mike referenced the fact that we're going to soon see mandatory security breach requirements. Could we or should we see mandatory security vulnerability requirements? And the answer, as Mike suspected, is no. To my knowledge, anyway, nobody's thinking in that direction. But it's certainly an interesting idea, and in some ways, it comes from the same place as mandatory security breach. And so you may know that mandatory security breach actually got its start at a law school in the United States, at the University of California at Berkeley. As they have a law clinic there that sort of dreamed up the idea and noted that that a mandatory security breach model had the nice effect of both creating incentives for organizations to secure their data, because of course they don't want to be subject to the cost associated with the breach and the embarrassment, and the nice fact that people would be notified and thus could mitigate against potential risks they faced, things like identity theft and the like. And so it was in that sense kind of win-win, because it created the right incentives for both users and for businesses. I think you can make an interesting argument to suggest that the same might well be true on a security vulnerability side, especially if you built in certain rules that allowed organizations to address the problem before some of the disclosures, and so that the risks themselves, the risks would be reduced. But so it's an interesting idea to float, actually. I think I like it. But in terms of whether or not the government is thinking about it, not to my knowledge. But of course, one thing that was said to me was that, listen, the prior bill, so a lot of people have been looking to an earlier bill that failed, sort of for guidance on where the government may be going, may not be and is unlikely to be certainly identical to what we see. So there's still it's still one of those issues that when it does come forward, and what I suspect from a timing perspective will happen is that the government will first introduce its or promote its digital policy. So it's long overdue. I think many would say Digital Canada policy. Part of that will probably include a privacy component, and then some months later, the government will formally introduce that privacy legislation, and then we'll, of course, wait to see exactly the kinds of requirements that it's envisioned.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael. I want to thank you personally for your time. And what a great way to kick off AtlSecCon 2014. So just so you can see.
That looks great. That looks great.
Yeah.
I'm glad everybody made it through the weather to come out.
Absolutely. So for those that have questions remaining for Michael, his Twitter handle is up there. He's a fantastic source for Canadian privacy. And I've been following Michael for quite a while, and overjoyed that even though he's not here physically, He's here virtually to present Canadian perspective and the global perspective with regards to the surveillance and what are they watching and the legal ramifications. So fantastic. I suspect that there will be a lot of open debates in the vendors lounge and some of the lounging areas with regards to your presentation. So I want to thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we'll get to see you soon physically.
I hope so as well. Thanks so much, Andy.
Thank you,
everyone.
All right, Michael, thank you. I'm going to end our meeting, and we'll be,
Okay.
we'll be in contact.
Okay, great. Take care, Andy.
Thank you.